Um, when we drafted the sustainability climate change strategy for Coventry, we have 5 pathways. Um, one of them is around reducing carbon. The other one was around circular economy, which is like minimizing waste and reusing things. We have one on equity and making sure that there's a just transition for people who are excluded, that they're not disadvantaged to a greater degree than other people in the city when we face environmental issues. And the other one that is particularly important is biodiversity and about looking to encourage wildlife. But the one which actually had the least response from the public, the one that people felt least interested in or concerned about, was quite surprising. It was about adaptation and resilience, which actually, of all those 5 themes, this is the one that directly impacts on people in very real ways. And as a consequence of that, we've been spending the last couple of years doing a lot of research, getting data, looking at risks across the city for adaptation and resilience. And we were also invited by DEFRA to be one of the pilot authorities for what's called an ARP4 report. So we're one of the first authorities to actually do that, and we helped influence DEFRA and how it went about doing that for the future for local authorities. So it's looking very likely that local authorities will have to produce these reports. They're 5 yearly, but they are looking at the state of an area in terms of the condition in relation to addressing adaptation and resilience. So the question is, do we understand what's caused all this? And recently I did a workshop for teachers from schools in Coventry, and it was quite interesting hearing their responses, and found it I'm going to present a little bit of that to you, because it was some background which helps people understand climate change and how it relates to adaptation and resilience, because there's a very strong relationship. Um, and it's dealing with the impact. So the other 4 themes around trying to reduce the problems. This one's about dealing with them as they occur and predicting what's going to happen. About 25-30 years ago, I was quite young. I don't know how it happened, freakish. uh, I think it was an accidental invite personally, but I was invited to this meeting, and it was at the Linnean Society in London, and it had the top civil servants of the government, and economists and people from the Treasury, looking at what would it be like in the UK 20 years time due to climate change. So basically, I'm seeing it now. So it was quite interesting. And I was incredibly depressed sitting in the meeting, listening to people saying what will happen, as if we couldn't do anything about preventing it from happening. They turned out to be right. And some of the things he talked about, like the agriculture economy, that Britain will become a wine producer, and actually could compete with France and everything. And in fact, that's the case. So West Sussex um, has now got the best champagnes, well, in the Champagne district, but outside of. But that's due to climate change. We're now starting to change. Farmers are changing the crops that they're farming. I saw a program very recently about a farmer that's now growing olives, which I thought was never going to happen, but they're actually growing olive groves because they can see that to produce olive oil locally, it will get a much premium price. It'd be a very good economic crop. So changes are happening, but the public don't necessarily understand that or accept that. And maybe that's why they didn't vote it as a high issue, which is quite surprising. So I'll talk about this because affects all of us in the council, and I'll talk about why. So if I could just get the next slide up, which is, there it is. Hang on. People sending me emails which are obscuring the slide. So one thing I think it's really important to get across when we talk about adaptation, resilience, and climate change, and understanding climate change. Climate has changed in the past, and it's changed more extremes than we have at present. So what's the issue? The issue is It's the speed of the change that's the concern. Because when things move quickly, nothing can adapt to those changes in time to cope with the changes. As you can see here, it's also the scale of the change at present is really high. As you can see, it's going off the scale. So one of the concerns, we've always had warm and cool periods in history, but as you can see, the peaks are getting higher. So we have to map out what's going to happen with our climate. Let me just move the control panel over. That's better. So to understand it, it's a lot more complex than people realize. They think about when carbon dioxide gets into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels. It does a number of things. The planet has natural control systems. So the more carbon dioxide there is, the higher the population. If you see at the bottom right, you see these little green things. They're what called coccolithophores. They are phytoplankton. They're really incredibly small, but they have calcium carbonate shells. So what they do is they grow, they fix the carbon into carbonate, which then sinks to the seabed. And if you think about the cliffs of Dover and what have you, that's what that is. That's locked carbon over millions of years that plants have locked in. This time is marine plankton. We're now getting to the point of saturation. Actually, you can't get more of those growing when the carbon dioxide levels rises because we reach the saturation point. The other thing is that as the climate's getting warmer, the ice is melting in the North Pole, and we're going to start seeing North Pole where actually there won't be any ice for a period, and that is affecting the chemistry of the oceans, which affects a whole range of things in terms of the acidification of the ocean. So if you think when you put acid on calcium carbonate, what happens? It dissolves, it releases carbon dioxide. So we have a problem because we're seeing the fact that the oceans are changing, and if anyone saw that film, the disaster movie, which was looking at climate change, it's not entirely fictional. There is a serious concern about ocean currents and how they affect. So every little thing. So when whales die, they lock 60,000 tons a year of carbon. So if we do whaling, whatever, reduce the whale population, we actually affecting the carbon cycle. So it's interesting to think of all the different things. If we think of this planet of ours, it's amazing how complex it is and how sophisticated the mechanisms are which help to make the Earth a livable planet. So, for example, those coccolithophores that also fix carbon also release dimethyl sulfide into the atmosphere, and dimethyl sulfide creates clouds, and clouds reflect the sunlight and help to keep the Earth cool. So there's a whole range of sophisticated actions that are going on that are natural control mechanisms, the oceans, but also on land. And one of the concerns is if you go to the northern tundra and the northern parts of Europe and the world, you find that a lot of the soil is very cold, and peat deposits build up. So carbon builds up with peat. But as it gets warmer, that peat then starts to decompose and it releases methane. And methane is 10 times worse than carbon as a heat gas that actually absorbs radiation. So, in fact, the warmer the north gets, it's not just the fact that the ice melting affects the soil chemistry, the chemistry, the oceans, everything, but it also is releasing methane, which is actually a concern. So there's a whole series of complex interactions on the planet, which create all sorts of uncertainties. So when people are trying to predict what's happening, they're trying to predict something with lots and lots of different variables and factors that affect the climate. So as we see, we're trying to keep our temperature down. The Paris Agreement was to try and agree that we shouldn't allow an average temperature rise to go above 1.5. That's average, so it could go above 1.5, but only for short periods of time. Because doesn't, if it does go higher, we don't know about those mechanisms that we've got, those natural control mechanisms, whether they'll end up being what they call feedback or whether they end up just increasing. So like the melting of the permafrost and release of methane, if that just continues, that can go out of control. And we could get past the point where any natural systems can't cope with it and actually restrict the amount of carbon that gets released. So there's this really complex interactions, and the public often don't understand that. And they're told simple things like, "Well, we had an ice age, we had this," but one of the reasons is this is the consequence if we exceed 1.5 degrees. So oceans will rise. 10 million people will become homeless because much of the population lives on coastal areas. 2 million square kilometers of permafrost could be lost. And that's the way we're talking about locking the carbon in the form of peat. Water scarcity as temperature rises. Obviously, the availability of water will be less. And we could see like ice-free Arctic summers, one per century, which is kind of extreme to think that that's a possibility. And we could lose up to 50% of our species because of the changes. And to understand that and why the speed of change is such an important thing, plants and animals, and I did a bit of paleoecology when I was at university, which we were looking at pollen and seed deposits in peat beds going back through the centuries. So you could see what the climate was like. You could analyze and see what the climate was like. And we could map out those different species. In this case, it's a species of Quercus, an oak, and how after the ice age, it spread and it managed to spread. It managed to do that because the pace was slow. If you're looking at the pace of climate change now, plants that can adapt, if you look at altitude, for example, the amount of rainfall, the temperature, everything else that changes, well, those plants that literally are alpine right at the top are most probably going to be at risk. But also, can the plants actually move? So if you see these bars, they're the kind of ability for a plant to disperse itself. So if a location becomes too arid, that plant will die. But would its seeds manage to go to the place which is actually still moist for it to grow, and vice versa? So there's a real problem there because actually we know from all the research we've done with plants before, we know what the rate of change is and how plants adapt. So we're going to have to do things very differently. We're going to be a lot more interventionist if we're going to protect things in the future. So it's not often understood. So I just thought give you that bit of background about why it's important to consider climate change and the pace of change and how it affects us. Now, this is literally a very recent report, and there's a really good video on the website for the Climate Change Committee, which is the board, the body that advises Parliament and government on climate change issues. And this is a kind of part of the report here. So the period between October 2022 to March 24 was the wettest 18 months on record for England. Large amounts of farmland were underwater for long periods, which led to the second worst arable harvest in England since modern harvest records began. And this came on the back of record-breaking heat waves in summer 22, saw temperatures exceeding 40 degrees centigrade for the first time in many places, and resulted in a record level of 3,000 heat-related deaths recorded in England. Now, heat is a real issue. I'm going to talk a bit about that afterwards because there's something about heat we don't know enough about its effects in many respects. Simultaneously, the hot and dry conditions led to an unprecedented number of wildfires. So a 500% increase in 999 calls for forest fires and grass fires. So it's astounding. And this report is the second report again that's been negative. Basically, they summed up and said that the previous report was really damning, but nothing has changed. If anything, it's got a bit worse. So it's a real wake-up call to the government to say you've got to do something. There needs to be action. So what does it mean for Coventry? So for us, we know from all the research that's been done with the Met Office and the University of Birmingham being involved in some work as well. But we know that we're going to have hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. Now, that doesn't mean that we still don't have cold. There's still not a problem that affects people, because it will. It's not the severity of the cold spells that's the cause of death in many people in terms of the cold. So we will still have the winter mortality issue to address, in the fact that this is on the whole warmer. But the problem is, it's also water supply. So if you see the temperatures are rising, and as they do, the amount of precipitation is decreasing in the summer months considerably more than it's increasing in the winter months. So in fact, we have a net deficit in terms of water supply. So it's reducing. So we're facing a scenario where we've got reducing water supply and more extreme weather conditions, more erratic patterns of weather, unpredictable. So when we get cold snap, could end up being late spring or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the winter time that's going to have it. It's going to be a very, very disruptive. And that's one of the key features with climate change. One of the key things is these unpredictable patterns that occur in weather. So what we've been doing as a council and work with partners, you've got the Adaptation and Resilience Pathway Group that's chaired by a colleague, Suzanne Ward, in the Environment Agency. And we commissioned CAG consultants with Sustainability West Midlands and another specialist, IT specialist called Slingshot Solutions, to try and map out these issues down at a very local level. Now, this is really interesting because it's the first time that any ARP reports have gone down to geographical detail. So local authorities, of course, being local authorities, are concerned about what affects the population and recognise that it's going to be different issues in different places. So what we're trying to understand is, what are the types of risks? So the types of flood risks which exist. So an area there, Neil Thomas's team have been doing a lot of work over the years. Flood is less of an issue for us in the sense of understanding the issue, but still is becoming an issue, and it's still something to deal with. But actually, I think we've got a better grip on it. Heat, on the other hand, a lot more difficult. So this is the most detailed we could get in terms of a heat map for the city at the moment. Now we're working with the Met Office, are working on this as a result of our ARP work, and other authorities have similar problems. We have a strategic energy partner, E.ON, that were part of had a subscription with the European Space Agency, but unfortunately don't anymore, because we were going to try and use their satellites to give us the imagery for the city. It costs a fortune to be part of that, and we couldn't afford it. So we're trying to get this information. So this is an ongoing piece of work that we're trying to do, is get a much better picture of heat maps. Some cities like Berlin have got some really quite detailed heat maps, and as a result of that, and knowing where to put tree planting and painting surface of roofs of buildings to help cool reflective surfaces to reflect the heat back, so to stop the sort of absorption of radiation. But we're trying to do that. We also been working with the Combined Authority, and you can go online and see this site, which gives you a number of variables, and you can click on the down to super output area. You can click on them, and it'll tell you the risks. So the yellow are the higher risk, the purple the least risk. So you can see the inner city areas, Hillfields, Foes Hill, all those areas are more at risk than say parts of Tile Hill or whatever. So you can see there's the difference there. And again, this relates to our just transition work as well, because actually we recognise that it's the people living in disadvantaged areas that are most probably disproportionately affected as well. So it's something we need to address. So when we did our analysis, what we have to do is we have to look at the risk of the activity happening, so the chance of a flood hitting a particular geographical area, how many people it affects, are there particular groups in the population that are particularly vulnerable, and also how can we adapt to it? How able are we to do something that will make a difference? And what's the severity? What will be the consequences if something going wrong? So it was really interesting to see that our top risk that came out was around food safety and food security. Turned out to be something which Professor Tim Lang, who's the government's leading advisor on food policy and food policy matters. He actually is the president of Garden Organic, but so I know him from years back, so know him quite well. And he's really interested in what we've been doing in Coventry. And he's just produced a report. It took him 3.5 years to write, but he's done a report for the National Preparedness Committee, which basically says the UK is not prepared for any food crisis situation. We don't even have a basic store. So countries like Switzerland actually have I don't know how they do it, but they've got food supply that can last a year for the population. So if something dramatic, catastrophic happens, they'll know that they'll be able to feed the population. We don't have 3 days. I mean, some countries got 3 days. We don't have anything really. It's not really been seen as a real risk. So, and this one we had mapped out because of what's happening globally as well. So how much food do we produce that's local? And how are we dependent upon stuff that's happening globally? So if you think of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is one of the major grain producers, that's affected world food prices because grain feed cattle with, grain is making bread and other products, a key staple. But of course, conflict has reduced the supply and it's having effects on prices. And similarly in other parts of the world, which are facing climate change issues, which are affecting the ability to grow crops. So there is an issue around, well, how resilient are we? How much food growing do we do ourselves? Is it possible to do that? And particularly for people who are disadvantaged as well. We've been doing it as a health issue around healthy diets and fresh foods and fresh fruit and vegetables. So there's a similar kind of tie in there. Also, the risks to infrastructure networks. And I was in a meeting with National Grid with some representatives from E.ON, who are our strategic energy partner. And the chap from E.ON and myself looked at each other in absolute shock, horror, when asking National Grid what audits they've done, risk assessments they've done on our electricity substations, and what are the key risks. And they gave us a vacant stare. They haven't done it yet. So we kind of said, well, if there's serious winds or things that affect an area, put this into context, all of our water supply is pumped electrically. We don't have any gravitational feed in Coventry. It's all electric. So if we have something catastrophic happening to our electricity supply to the city, we'll run out of water in a day. There's a Mighty Oak programme, and actually Colin Knight went to that, and he came back and he kind of said, but how much do you need to do the consultancy for because basically it's a big issue, and he recognised the risks that there are. So we've been working on a number of things. So these are the assessments. So you get the exposure score, how many people exposed, what's the level of sensitivity, how can it impact on us, what would the impact be if it does. Adaptive capacities, our ability to do something. So you add the exposure and sensitivity score, and then you take away the adaptive capacity score, and you end up with what our vulnerability is. That's the national way in which they do it. There's a level of subjectivity to it, but it's based on data. So you're looking at data, you're coming up, if you've got like population size, is it a percentage? If it's such and such a percentage, it scores higher, and if you go above a certain other percentage, it goes higher again. So the scoring relates to the level of people affected, the duration of the incident, the area it covers, and that's those sorts of factors. So you can see, so we've got risks to infrastructure, risks to public water supplies, risks to health well-being from high temperatures. So I mentioned about heat risk is clearly something here, and our adaptive capacity at the moment is not very high. What do we need to do to address that issue? How can we deal with it? Exposure at the moment is lower, but actually could increase quite dramatically over the years. So we've had a few hot spells, but we need to address that. So risks to health and well-being, risks to people, communities, buildings, and flooding. We know those are well established. One of the things that we've also picked up is that businesses are not prepared. They actually don't have plans. There's a lot of businesses in flood risk areas, and we delayed our production of the report by about 6 to 9 months because we then got a new set of data around flood risk and some other risks which came through from Environment Agency. So we had to readdress the scoring systems, reassess the situation, and certain risks, and like risks to businesses, increased quite dramatically. So risks to water quality and household supplies. And risks to health and social care delivery. And I really like to talk a bit about that later, because that's something that I think not many people know about. And I was in a meeting with other authorities for the whole of the Midlands, and a bit further as well. Some from Lincolnshire talking about what they were doing in terms of their care homes and what they think they need to do. So that's a high priority vulnerabilities. We also have some medium ones as well. So risks to businesses from productivity loss. Again, when you think heat affects productivity, risks to building fabric, opportunities there, in the risks to infrastructure, bridges and the like. Many of those we've got things in hand to deal with, but they're still important. And then there's ecological things like risks to the habitats. So as temperature rises, the oxygen levels in water drop, the species diversity drops, and there's all sorts of potential risks there. Water quality as well becomes an issue. There's lots of plans. We've done the risk assessment adaptation report, round 4. The government's just produced progress reports from the Climate Change Committee. Tim Lang's report around the 7 steps to try and get civil food resilience. And we've also done with our partnership. As you know, we have a partnership with Warwickshire and Solihull in emergency response. So we've been working very closely with that team, because obviously what we would be doing might help to reduce what they have to deal with when the situations arise. So we're about adapting and being resilient. They're about dealing with it when it actually happens on the day when something goes wrong. And I've got experience of that, and I know what that looks like. So anything we can do that helps reduce that problem will be advantageous. So the question is, so how do these affect health and well-being, all these incidents? And as I said, I've actually been involved in, I've led for my area. I used to be a director in Birmingham. We had the River Cole flood twice, causing serious flooding in localized areas. One business actually went to war, which employed 300 people as a consequence of flooding. We always had a major pollution incident, miraculously survived that, but we had a number of issues. But also, the bottom left there, you see that car in someone's building. That was the tornado. That was the Birmingham tornado. Yeah, I had a tornado to deal with. Not what one would expect, but again, Coventry had a tornado. I don't know how many of you know that, but we had one not too long ago. Fortunately, it just ripped out some garden fences and things, but it was quite small. The Birmingham one, I saw photographs of it. There was a professional photographer in the area at the time. It was full size. It was like a tornado you see in the United States. Fortunately, though, it was very short-lived. It only lasted a few minutes, but it's a miracle no one was seriously injured. Cars were thrown, literally thrown around like they were just packets of paper. Um, so there's a real and people. There's some people that you go to in that area were still traumatized by the incident. Um, and I can understand it. And I went literally after the scene. I couldn't believe my eyes what I was looking at. It ripped the roof off a supermarket, brand new roof, had been built recently, so it wasn't like some old rickety structure or anything. It was trees were ripped up. We lost one part, lost half the trees in the park were torn up. So there's massive. Some of these things could be quite devastating in terms of their impact. And obviously, immediate threat, risk and injury, but also there's other long-term risks and risk of exposure to heat, for example. How do we deal with those? So all of these things are on the cards, will happen at some point or other. I'm not saying a tornado can necessarily happen again, but they are possible. And we have to be prepared for those sorts of things that might occur. So I sort of focus on extreme heat. So the chances of temperature exceeding 40 degrees is now 20 times more likely than it was in the 60s. And it's tripled since 2000. So that really is a significant shift. And 50-50 chance for this thing for the Met Office, for 40 degrees centigrade occurring by around 2037. I mean, this is where that gets really critically serious for people. I mean, that's seriously injurious, 40 degrees. But also we have heat waves over 28 degrees. Now, the thing about that is that it's the period, the duration that they're going to be on. So it's not just, I don't know if anyone was around in 1976 when we had a drought, but that was pretty significant with water shortages and everything else. Tree deaths, forests were literally affected. Yeah, it was not fun. So the effects of heat on our physiologies. So yeah, we know about dehydration, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, which can lead to organ failure, worsening particularly people with heart conditions, diabetes, respiratory illness, kidney disease, affects our sleep, affects our cognitive function and work capacity. That thing earlier was put us at risk because actually when people are in hotter conditions, the cognitive functions are not as good as they would be if they were below optimum temperature. So how do we keep workplaces cool? And who's the most vulnerable? So that's the other thing. It's not just that people are particularly vulnerable that we need to deal with, that we have to consider. So how do we do this? So adaptation, to give an example, is if, for example, we're planting street trees in Coventry, we need to plant trees that come from somewhere 2 degrees south of here, because by the time they start growing up as trees, that temperature would have increased to the point which would be like what people living 2 degrees south of us have as their average temperature. And that might well mean planting foreign street trees, different trees that are better adapted to hot weather and drier conditions. So that's a kind of the adaptation, changing the way we do things, changing the way that we deliver services. Resilience is about what makes us stronger and capable to keep on going, and how we plan for that, how we do things differently, how do we make changes. So give an example here. At the moment, and this is something I raised with DEFRA when we were doing the ARP reform report, if you go for a grant for a heat pump, you can use certain heat pumps for cooling. You can use them like an air conditioning system. So you can warm the house, but can also use them to cool the house. But if you do, with the grants that DESNZ provide, it will be deducted from your grant because it's seen as a perk. It's seen as a luxury. It's not a thing you should do. Now, we've argued with DEFRA that with rising temperatures, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. And why are we penalising people to be able to switch? All I have to be able to do is just switch the system so it does cooling. And we have to, at the moment, we have to actually switch that off, deactivate it, because otherwise it affects the person's grant. But 3 years later, they can then reactivate it because it's a 3-year period that the rules apply for. But it's a nonsense. So we've DEFRA are now challenging that and trying to get that so that we can do it. So simple things that can help people to be cool, we might not necessarily have. You would have seen in the city centre, I've forgotten the name of the street now, but we do have living walls. And have a car park which has them. We also have a street right near, not far from City Hall, where you'll see strips of planting, and that helps to keep cool down, and also it helps to absorb pollutants as well. So you're seeing this more commonly now, and in Birmingham there's quite a few examples of living walls, or sedum roofs. So sedum's a plant that's pretty well adapted to hot conditions, but it absorbs the heat. And it reflects back as well, so it helps to cool the city down. And if you go to cities like Malmo, the council building in Malmo is brilliant. So it's one massive roof which has got sedum planting all over it, and the staff actually sit out and hang out, chill out on the roof of this building. That's the Malmo City Council, but they did that years ago. But it helps to cool the city down, cool the buildings down in the summer months. But simple things like people having water butts. So it used to be really common. Everyone used to, in the wartime, used to collect rainwater off the roof. And if we get water shortages, watering the garden, why not better than using something that's been collected that otherwise would just run down the drains and be lost. And also creating, if you see that housing development where we're putting areas which have got plants in and soil, that's to allow the water to slowly percolate through. The more hard surfaces we get, the more flooding we get, because water's got nowhere to go. It just flows quickly then, and then we lose it. It's lost, and it usually results in serious flooding. So swales and wetland areas around amongst housing developments, depressions in the ground to where the floodwater can go to, so it doesn't flood the home, it floods somewhere else, which actually is all right because it's a habitat which animals can live in, and it's perfectly okay. I have one near my house actually where I live at the moment. There's one which has got reed beds in, and that is a flood alleviation project. So more projects like that. We have a program in Coventry because we know that deprived areas in Coventry have least access to green space. We know that, and we think, well, also they're the highest risk of flooding. So what does it mean to delivering services? So we've got something actually what we put that's in our strategy to do air alert, which is people with COPD, for example, high temperatures, and photochemical reactions can, for example, increase the levels of ground level ozone. And ozone we need up in the upper atmosphere. That's really helpful and protective. But down on the ground is actually a serious problem. It causes constriction of airways. So not particularly friend of asthmatics and the like. We now have West Midlands Combined Authority, as a consequence of what we were doing, have now we're going to have air alert. It's going to be launched, I think, later on this month, for the whole of the West Midlands, so that people with certain conditions can have an app, and it's linked to our air quality measuring stations, and it'll give them a report as to when the levels are high or low, whether it's all right, safe to go out. So I introduced this when I was working in Eastleigh, and people were really critical and saying, oh, you're making people scared to go out. In fact, it did the opposite. People that were scared to go out had the app and realized that actually it was safe to go out. It was all right. The levels weren't critical. They assumed they'd be bad. So actually, it's helpful at giving people information that helps make decisions as to what they want to do. We're also doing a lot of research around indoor air quality in Jean Bouchier, University of Birmingham. We've got an £8.5 million project, which is working for us, Birmingham and Wolverhampton, looking at indoor air quality, the conditions, how that's affected by different types of retrofit, how it's affected by temperature and other factors as well, to understand what we need to do. And then there's things like advice and support for frontline social care. What should that be? What form should that take? Retrofitting for cold as well as heat. So we've been doing retrofit work for cold weather, but what about when it's hot to cool places down? Care homes, unbelievable temperatures. A chap in Lincolnshire said that was 1 degree off from being critical. That's the normal running temperature. He said they've got to lower the temperatures. They're too high, and the thermostats would not be sensitive enough to be able to cope. So we could be putting people into risk situations. As you know, we've been talking about creating warm spaces for people to go to, libraries and things. Similarly, need to do the same with heat. So cool spaces that people go to, and are the parks, are there like open space, are there buildings that got air conditioning and the like. Food growing close to home, looking at planting, encouraging horticultural skills, help to cool the house down. How many houses have concrete frontages with no plants on? It's a natural recipe for increased risk of flooding, but also in terms of heat, it's heat absorption. It's going to help cool the house down, let's put it that way. Encouraging preparedness and community support. We've got some series of bids in at the moment to work with community groups to help them identify some of the risks and issues. Combined Authority just set up around some 4 world cafes across Coventry recently with community groups. So I'm getting waiting for the feedback from that to see what issues people are facing. And it's about people doing things differently. So, for example, if someone's going to rewire their house in a flood risk area, to think about what height they have the sockets, and that actually to raise the level and to use specific types of plaster that are water resilient, so that if their flood does if the home does flood, they'll be able to go back in it and recover and get back to normal. I remember having that conversation with a cabinet member, and one of our communications team is going ballistic. You can't say that to people, that's awful. But the cabinet member said, yes, we have to, because it's reality. It's a difficult message, but it is a message that we will need to say, because we'll be saving people a lot of money and also helping them understand what they need to do. So what else is there? The list could be endless, really. So kind of leave it there at that point. I'll pass this question over to you. What do you think we need to do differently? And particularly think about heat. So I think if we focus on heat, because that's a key risk. We've got Coventry University at the moment. I've got a team that are working up a bid for Horizon 2020 funding, where we want to partner up with the Southern European cities that deal with heat on a regular basis. And we'll help them deal with flood, because as you know, in Spain, they had a serious flood, which is highly uncharacteristic in Spain. So we'll be exchanging skills and experience, and hopefully learning from each other about how we can do things better. But there's been a bit of research with clinicians involved in looking about the understanding the heat effects, because that's something we really don't know enough about. So any questions or thoughts about what we could do?